Have you ever walked into a place and felt it instantly, that cold sting of 100 silent judgments, the stares that don't need words to say, you don't belong here? That's exactly what Aisha Monroe felt that night in the glittering first-class cabin of an international flight. First class. Plush leather seats. Champagne flutes catching the soft golden light. A world built for comfort, but for Aisha, it became a stage for humiliation. Because Evelyn Cross was there, draped in designer brands, moving not like a person, but like a performance. She looked Aisha up and down, a young black woman dressed simply but with unshakable poise. And her eyes said it all. How did you get here? And then she said it out loud, not a whisper, not a hint of politeness. I don't feel safe with her. The flight attendant froze. Passengers turned. And Evelyn. She doubled down, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police. Minutes later, 2 air marshals stepped on board. The cabin fell silent. And suddenly, Aisha wasn't a passenger anymore. She was on trial, judged by everyone in that room. Evelyn smiled. She thought she'd won. But here's the thing about people you try to humiliate. Sometimes, they're the ones holding all the power. Aisha didn't argue, didn't beg. She simply stood, gathered her things, and before walking away, she turned to Evelyn and said, They'll be back, but next time it'll be for you. You think that was just a threat? It wasn't. Because the woman Evelyn called the police on was the pilot of the flight. This isn't just a story about a flight, it's about silent power, and how to turn humiliation into wings, to rise higher than ever before. If you've ever been judged for how you look, or want to see arrogance get what it deserves, hit like, share this story, and subscribe. And that is how it began. One cabin, one look, one accusation, sparking a fire that would change everything. On that red-eye from New York to London, before the chaos, Aisha Monroe just wanted peace, but then Evelyn Cross walked in. Evelyn Cross never just walked into a room, she arrived as if she owned it. Her long, tailored coat hugged her slim frame, every fold of the fabric draping with deliberate, expensive grace. The sharp click of her stiletto heels on the first-class cabin floor sounded less like footsteps and more like the gavel of a judge, announcing that she was here to pass judgment. Evelyn didn't walk, she advanced. Chin high, eyes sweeping over every face, tallying the worth of those around her. In Evelyn's world, first class wasn't simply a service, it was a statement. And anyone who stepped into this space without broadcasting the same frequency of status was to her an intruder. Anne. That's why her gaze froze when it landed on seat 2A, a thorn piercing through the protective layer of Chanel and cultivated superiority. Aisha Monroe sat there, a young black woman, simply dressed a soft, earth-toned sweater, tailored trousers, no screaming designer logos, no sparkling diamonds or high-end watches flaunting price tags. Only a quiet, inexplicable calm. She leaned slightly against the window, as though this flight belonged to her as naturally as the air itself, without needing permission, validation, or acknowledgement from anyone. And that infuriated Evelyn. They let anyone sit in first class now? The thought came unfiltered, sharp, before Evelyn could stop it. In this cabin, Aisha's presence disrupted the unspoken order Evelyn believed in this place was for people like her, not for people like that. Evelyn slowly lifted her designer cabin bag into the overhead bin, deliberately letting it graze the armrest just enough to force Aisha to notice. But Aisha didn't look up, didn't react. Only when Evelyn straightened, exhaling a frustrated breath, did Aisha glance up. And she smiled. Not a polite smile, not apologetic. It was a small, fleeting smile with the weight of 1,000 words, a smile that made Evelyn feel as though she'd been seen through. The smile said, I know exactly what you're thinking, and it doesn't bother me. Evelyn froze for a split second. a chill creeping up her spine. She hadn't spoken yet, but already she felt exposed as if she'd been caught trespassing in her own domain. She sank into seat 2B, leaning slightly toward Aisha, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Well, isn't that interesting? They really let anyone sit in first class these days, don't they?" Aisha didn't answer immediately. She closed the book in her hands, looked at Evelyn again, and kept the same quiet, unreadable smile. Maybe. Those who have a reason. That was it, simple, but to Evelyn, it felt like gasoline poured on a slow-burning fire. In first class, there are wars fought without shouting. Just one sentence, one smile that's enough to start the battle. Evelyn Cross wasn't used to silence, especially when she expected a reaction. She thrived on the awkward chuckles, the defensive explanations, the downward glances, little confirmations that she still owned the space. But Aisha Monroe didn't give her any of that. After that calm, lilted reply, she returned to her book as though Evelyn didn't exist. The dismissal cut deeper than an insult. It slammed a door in Evelyn's face, leaving her simmering in her own bruised ego. She cleared her throat, leaning in closer, determined to force a reaction. "Some people," Evelyn said sweetly, voice dipped in sugar but sharp as a blade, "are very good at squeezing through narrow doors. But eventually, people want to know how they got there." Still nothing. No furrowed brow, no withering glare, just the quiet, deliberate turn of a page Aisha's attention fully on the book, as if Evelyn's words held less value than ink on paper. In Evelyn's mind, first class was her stage, but now, the audience, other passengers in wide leather seats were shifting their focus. A man in the front row looked up, his eyes wary. A young couple whispered, one of them subtly lifting a phone, pretending to scroll but angling the lens toward her. Evelyn felt it, the shift. The cabin, once as still as a chapel, now thrummed with uneven heartbeats. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, and the sensation made her lash out instinctively. "You," Evelyn raised a hand toward a passing flight attendant. "There's a problem here." The attendant, a young woman with a strained, polite smile, paused, bending slightly to listen. Evelyn delivered her words like an arrow. "I don't feel comfortable with the person next to me. I think her seat needs to be verified." Aisha gently lifted her eyes from the page, not rushed, not angry. Just a brief, weighted glance that made Evelyn feel like she was the one being measured. Then Aisha lowered her gaze again, returning to her book. The silence in the cabin was unnatural, the kind that hums in your ears. Passengers pretended to stare at their screens, but every one of them was watching. An older man in 1A tilted his head, ready to intervene. Evelyn felt her pulse thudding at her temple, but she held a fixed, brittle smile. Only Aisha seemed untouched by the tension her silence like an invisible wall Evelyn couldn't breach. And to Evelyn, that silence was worse than defiance. It was a challenge, a dare. She'd had enough. "All right," Evelyn said loudly, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the cabin. "Show me your ticket, your boarding pass. I want to know how you got this seat." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Evelyn knew she was dragging the young flight attendant into her corner. In these first-class duels, you always needed an audience, and Evelyn would not lose. Aisha slowly closed her book. The motion was light, but final, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Her eyes met Evelyn's, not angry, not flustered, just serenely unreadable. The kind of calm that made Evelyn feel small. "My boarding pass," Aisha repeated softly, as if weighing the request. "Yes?" Evelyn folded her arms, tilting her head to claim more space. "I think we all deserve some clarity. This cabin is special. Not everyone belongs here." Aisha nodded slightly, like she understood Evelyn's obsession with belonging. She reached down into her small, sleek bag and pulled out a black leather wallet. Her movements were unhurried, almost agonizingly slow enough to make Evelyn want to claw at the armrest. And then she handed it to the flight attendant. It wasn't a flimsy printed pass, it wasn't a scuffed phone screen. It was a platinum card, gleaming. The attendant inhaled sharply. This wasn't an ordinary loyalty card. It was one of the ultra-exclusive elite memberships, the kind Evelyn herself once bragged about owning over cocktails, the kind she claimed almost no one can get. The cabin fell silent for a beat. Evelyn stared at the card as if it had betrayed her. This woman didn't just belong here. She had the kind of access Evelyn thought only people like her could claim. For one brief moment, Evelyn felt herself shrinking in her own world. But then, the old reflex returned pride. She lifted her chin, eyes on the attendant, and sneered. "That," she said, gesturing at the platinum card, "is easy enough to borrow." A few heads turned. Someone smirked. Evelyn couldn't tell if they were laughing with her or at her. But she knew one thing, this wasn't over. Aisha took back her card, smiled a smile even harder to read than before, and reopened her book, leaving Evelyn alone with her unspent rage. And that was only the beginning. The sharp ding of the call button cut through the cabin air, crisp and cold, like the edge of a blade tapping glass. Evelyn Cross no longer wanted to spar with glances or passive-aggressive remarks. She wanted witnesses. She wanted her opponent put on the spot. Forced to justify herself before a third party on ground Evelyn believed would favor her. A young flight attendant appeared, a blonde with the kind of practiced smile designed to soothe frayed nerves. The small name tag on her chest read Chloe. Evelyn immediately seized on her presence, using her like a megaphone for her indignation. "You," Evelyn said, pointing at Aisha, her voice loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "I don't feel safe with her. I think her information needs to be verified immediately." Maybe Evelyn didn't notice, but the way she said her changed the air in the cabin. The passengers, who had been quietly immersed in their screens, now lifted their heads, their eyes sweeping like radar for the source of this disturbance. A young couple whispered to each other, their phone tilting slightly subtly recording. The man in seat 1A, a silver-haired figure in a dark tailored suit, turned his head too, his gaze deep and deliberate. Chloe flinched slightly but kept her voice neutral. "Ma'am, could you tell me what exactly is making you uncomfortable?" "Sitting next to someone who doesn't belong here." Evelyn replied without hesitation. "I didn't pay to feel threatened in first class." Aisha closed the book in her hands, slowly, so deliberately it felt less like a reaction than a period at the end of a sentence. She lifted her gaze to Evelyn, meeting her directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark and still, like a winter lake, no surface ripples, but so deep that Evelyn felt herself being seen through. "Safety?" Aisha asked, her voice so soft that Chloe had to lean in to hear, or power. For a split second, Evelyn couldn't find words. Heat rose to her face, the sensation of her armor stripped away in front of a stranger. It wasn't just a question. It was a counterattack, and it hit exactly where Evelyn didn't expect her unshakable belief that she controlled this space. Chloe glanced between the two women, unsure which side to take. The silence between them thickened into a wall. Somewhere in the cabin, someone coughed softly, as if to remind everyone that they were watching. Evelyn licked her lips, forcing her voice back. "You know what I mean. And I have the right to request to be seated next to people who fit." But even Evelyn heard the tremor in her own words, and for the first time in years, she felt herself losing her grip on the stage. Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to Aisha briefly before snapping back to Evelyn as if instinct, drilled into new flight attendants, told her to side with the one who looked like power. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "if you're uncomfortable, I can reach out to verify the seating information. just to make sure everything is in order." Evelyn nodded, her lips pressing into a thin half-smile of victory. This was what she wanted, a public acknowledgement, an action that would make the entire cabin see she was being protected. Aisha stayed silent. She leaned back against her seat, gaze shifting to the window as though the entire exchange had nothing to do with her. That composure only deepened Evelyn's irritation, making her feel abandoned in a fight she thought she was winning. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted entirely. The whispers quieted not because passengers weren't interested, but because they were listening, watching, silent witnesses to a growing spectacle. A few exchanged furtive glances. A young woman in row 3 tilted her phone toward Evelyn, pretending to check messages while discreetly recording. And then, from the front row, a man's voice, low and deliberate, cut through the tension. "Lady." The cabin froze. The man was older, silver hair combed neatly back, his tailored suit understated but clearly expensive. He set down his espresso cup and turned halfway toward Evelyn. His eyes weren't loud, but they carried the quiet authority of someone used to making decisions that mattered. "Lady," he repeated, his voice calm but heavy enough to slice through the silence. "She's got more right to be here than you." The words hit like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone paused. A soft, "oh," escaped from somewhere at the back of the cabin, an involuntary reaction from an audience that had just witnessed the board flip. Chloe's eyes went wide, unsure how to respond. Evelyn whipped around toward the man, her face flushing crimson, but managed to force a stiff smile and mutter through clenched teeth, "Everyone wants to be a social media hero these days." No one replied, but the silence said more than words. Evelyn felt herself slipping on the stage she thought she controlled. For the first time since Evelyn had pressed the call button, Aisha turned back toward her. Her faint smile wasn't quite gratitude. It wasn't mockery either. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement, a silent declaration that the board had shifted and Aisha didn't need to move a single piece. In 1A, the older man lifted his espresso again, as though his words had been nothing more than a passing note in his day, but to Evelyn, they were a gut punch. First class was no longer quiet. It had transformed into a courtroom, and this time, Evelyn wasn't sitting on the bench. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms as though reclaiming control. She didn't say another word, only kept a thin, brittle smile plastered on her lips, the smile of someone who refused to admit she'd lost ground. The man in 1A turned back to his coffee. The other passengers slowly returned to their stillness, but it wasn't the validation Evelyn wanted. They weren't applauding her. They were waiting to see what happened next. Chloe gave a polite nod and walked away. Evelyn tracked her steps, relieved at the thought that this issue would be handled. In her mind, that meant verifying Aisha's seat, and if it didn't check out, ejecting her from first class, order restored. But Evelyn didn't hear Chloe's hushed words as she leaned toward a colleague near the cabin door. "We need security. Let them handle it." A simple sentence, but in this context, it was gasoline on a fire. Chloe thought she was following protocol, placating an elite passenger by promising verification. But in that moment, she didn't know she'd just pushed things across the line from a petty dispute between two travelers into a full-blown security incident requiring police. Aisha knew. She didn't need to hear every word, just a glance, Chloe's small nod to her coworker. Another attendant heading swiftly toward the exit told her everything. Aisha sighed softly, not with fear, but with recognition. She'd lived this too many times, watched too many small misunderstandings grow monstrous simply because her existence made someone feel unsafe. She turned toward the window, outside. The runway stretched beneath airport floodlights, glowing trails cutting across the night sky. Somehow, that scene felt calmer than the first-class cabin, where she was now the unwilling centerpiece of someone else's theater. Evelyn noticed the serene look and made her own assumption. She's pretending she isn't scared. But Evelyn didn't know Aisha wasn't pretending. She truly wasn't afraid. And she didn't realize that she herself had just stepped into the lead role in a story far bigger than she could control. Outside the cabin, a call was made, and somewhere in the airport, 2 security officers began walking toward the plane. First class returned to its hushed stillness, but it wasn't the same peace Evelyn knew. It was the silence before a storm, when everyone from the attendants to the passengers sensed a scene was about to unfold. Evelyn still thought she'd won. But the game she thought she controlled had changed its rules. And she was the one who had pushed it this far. The first-class cabin door swung open, and the air shifted instantly. 2 airport police officers stepped in with the kind of walk only people used to dealing with trouble possessed, slow, steady, claiming the space without saying a word. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, carried the kind of face carved by years of long nights in terminals. His partner, younger and sharper, let his eyes sweep the cabin quickly, as if cataloging every detail before acting. First class fell into silence, not the cushioned quiet of the privileged, but a dense, suffocating silence of people realizing they were witnessing something that belonged on a screen, not in front of them. Every breath suddenly felt loud, and Evelyn Cross smiled like justice had finally arrived to take her side. Finally, someone doing their job, she said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. She sat up straighter, arms crossed. The posture of a plaintiff confident her case was already won. The graying officer gave her a quick glance blank, unreadable before his eyes landed on Aisha Monroe. She sat there, utterly still, as if none of this involved her. No anger, no pleading, no flicker of unease. Aisha simply reached down, pulled her small handbag from under the seat, and placed it neatly beside her as if she were preparing to leave on her own schedule. Not anyone else's. No justifications, no protests. That composure made a few passengers swallow hard, as if they were watching someone sit on a hot seat and somehow not feel the burn. "Ma'am," the graying officer said, his voice low and steady like a report being read aloud. "We need to speak with you privately about this flight." Evelyn cut her eyes to Aisha, waiting for a flinch, a panicked denial, anything to prove her suspicions right. But Aisha only looked up. Her gaze so calm, Evelyn felt like she was the one being examined. A small nod, "I understand." That was it. Aisha rose, lifting her bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. As she stepped into the aisle, the air thickened, every eye tracking her movements. Someone quietly lifted a phone, trying to capture the moment without a sound. Aisha didn't look at Evelyn, didn't scan for a sympathetic glance. She walked like no one in that cabin had the right to judge her. Evelyn watched, sweet triumph bubbling in her chest. She didn't know the game she thought she was winning had just shifted into a chapter where she no longer held the wheel. "Ma'am, please step out for verification." The words were crisp, not a request but a procedure. The younger officer standing just behind his partner spoke with the flat, neutral tone used to keep tense situations from sparking. He tilted his head slightly, offering a path, and the cabin was so quiet someone's sharp breath from the back row echoed like a whistle. But Aisha didn't move immediately. She placed her hand on the strap of her bag, her gaze locked on the graying officer, the clear superior, before she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every ear in the cabin. "Is it the ticket, or the prejudice that needs verifying?" No one breathed. The question wasn't just for the officers. It landed like a stone thrown into a pond, sending ripples through everyone seated there. A few people lowered their eyes, avoiding hers. Others exchanged uneasy glances, as if silently asking themselves if they'd dare answer if that question were aimed at them. The older officer paused, then said evenly, "We're just following procedure, ma'am." "Procedure?" Aisha repeated, as if tasting the word. She didn't argue, didn't object, but the way she said it stripped it bare, no longer neutral, just a curtain hiding the truth everyone could already see. She stood, slowly, deliberately. Her hand tightened on her bag's strap without a tremor, her face unshaken, fearless. There was weight in that stillness, the kind of weight that made a few passengers lower their phones for a moment, as though afraid of being caught in her gaze. Evelyn watched, that sweet surge of victory rising higher. She sat straighter, chin lifted, as though she'd restored order to first class. To her, this was proof of everything she believed Aisha didn't belong here. But not everyone saw it that way. The man in 1A crossed his arms, his eyes following Aisha with quiet calculation. The young couple in row 3 sat frozen, their phones still recording silently. A woman in 2D shook her head subtly, her lips pressed tight like she was swallowing back words she wanted to say. Aisha didn't glance at Evelyn, didn't search for allies. She simply walked, stepping through the narrow aisle, leaving behind a cabin full of people now forced to confront the silence of their own complicity. In that moment, Evelyn didn't realize Aisha had just held up a mirror reflecting how prejudice survives, not just through big actions, but through quiet stares and wordless consent. And so, while Evelyn thought she'd won, the rest of the cabin had already begun to wonder won what and at what cost. Aisha took another step toward the exit, then stopped. The air in first class was so thick it felt like no one dared breathe. Evelyn stared, waiting for a plea, a beg for mercy, or at least a glance conceding defeat. But what came next was something entirely different. Aisha turned to face Evelyn, not with spite, not with hate. Just a calmness so unnerving it chilled Evelyn to her core, the look of someone who knew exactly who she was and needed no one's permission to exist. "You called them for me," Aisha said softly, almost like an observation. Then her eyes narrowed slightly, and the next words dropped like cold stones. "But they'll be back, for you." The cabin froze. A woman in 2D sucked in a sharp breath. The man in 1A tilted his head, his eyes lighting up like he'd just witnessed a masterful chess move no one else saw coming. Chloe, near the cabin door, furrowed her brow, unsure whether the statement was a threat, a prophecy, or just an offhand remark. Evelyn felt an icy shiver crawl up her spine. She opened her mouth to retort, but couldn't find words sharp enough to cut through what had just happened. That wasn't a loud statement. But it hit somewhere. Evelyn had never allowed anyone to reach the fear of being seen for who she really was. "What does that even mean?" Evelyn snapped, her voice pitched higher than she intended. Aisha didn't answer. She turned away, continuing toward the two officers. That movement was its own period cold, decisive, leaving no room for debate. Evelyn gripped her armrest hard, trying to suppress the sinking feeling that the game had just flipped. She told herself it was just a cheap provocation, a line meant to rattle her, but the tremor in her chest betrayed her. The other passengers couldn't shake it either. That sentence, devoid of context, explanation, or apology, hung in the air, planting an unspoken question in every mind. What did she mean? Why did she say that? And what if she's right? Evelyn forced a smile, but it quivered, collapsing into the void where no one answered. Aisha walked on, her small bag swaying gently with her steps. The cabin door opened, and she disappeared with the two officers, leaving behind a cabin heavy with unspoken thoughts and one pale-faced woman sitting in her seat, unable to shake the echo of those words. Aisha hadn't promised, she hadn't threatened. But with one simple sentence, she'd changed the entire atmosphere. Evelyn, who believed she'd been in control, now felt like a pawn being moved in a game whose rules she didn't even understand. And first class, once Evelyn's domain, had become the stage for a play she would never control. At the airplane door, the air was nothing like first class. It was cold and utilitarian harsh fluorescent lights, worn carpeting dulled by countless feet. The two airport police officers blocked the exit professional, closed off. They didn't look at Aisha like a person. They looked at her like a situation to be managed. Evelyn stayed in her seat but leaned forward slightly, watching every move. From where she sat, she could catch bits of the exchange, and in her mind, she was already savoring the taste of victory. When she saw Aisha standing before the officers, she arched an eyebrow, telling herself, "Now, get her off this plane." "Identification," the older officer said. He extended his hand, his voice flat, his gaze that of a man who'd done this 1,000 times at 1,000 gates. Aisha didn't argue. She reached into her small bag, rummaged briefly, then handed him 2 items. First, a neat leather wallet. From it, she produced her driver's license slowly, deliberately, as though she wanted every person watching to see. But that wasn't what drew all the attention. Along with it, she handed over another card, sleek, sharp, heavy with authority. The officer's brows furrowed. His eyes scanned it carefully, as though reading words the rest of the cabin couldn't see. Evelyn squinted, straining to catch a glimpse. But from that distance, all she could make out was a flash of silver under the light and a few markings she couldn't decipher. Curiosity mingled with unease. What is that, a membership card, a clearance pass? She didn't know, but instinct told her this wasn't the kind of credential just anyone could carry. The younger officer glanced at his partner, his face briefly betraying surprise. They exchanged a silent look, short, but heavy with an entire unspoken conversation. The older man nodded slightly, as though a puzzle had just clicked into place. "Wait here," he said, his voice quieter now, but firmer. "We'll verify this with the airline immediately." Aisha didn't ask questions. She stood tall, hands lightly clasped in front of her, radiating a poise so unnervingly calm it made the whole scene feel off. She had nothing to lose, but she didn't look like someone on the defensive. Evelyn, from her seat, fidgeted like an impatient spectator stuck in an opening act that dragged too long. She wanted to see this woman escorted out, wanted confirmation that she was right. But that card, that strange, unfamiliar thing, kept her satisfaction on a leash. For a fleeting moment, Evelyn felt a chill at the base of her neck. Aisha's earlier words echoed in her head. "They'll be back, for you." Evelyn shivered. She didn't know why, but instinct told her that card wasn't the end of Aisha's story. It was the beginning of something Evelyn wasn't ready to face. And then, a new voice shattered the tension. A sharp sound curtain ring sliding across a rail. The heavy partition between first class and the cockpit pulled aside. From behind it, a man emerged. Pristine white uniform, 4 golden stripes gleaming on his shoulders. He didn't walk like a service worker. He walked like a man who carried hundreds of lives with every step. "Captain Monroe," he said, his voice ringing clear, devoid of hesitation or apology. "We need you in the cockpit." The words detonated in the cabin. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye snapped toward Aisha, pulled by an invisible cord. Evelyn's mouth fell open. It took her several seconds to process the words. Captain Monroe. That title, that name, crashed against everything she thought she knew like a slap across the face. She darted her gaze around, searching for someone to meet her eyes, someone to confirm she hadn't misheard. But no one looked back at her. They were all staring at Aisha not with the disdain they'd worn earlier, but with something closer to awe. Aisha said nothing. She tilted her head slightly toward the pilot, then looked at the officers. "We're done here," she asked, calm as if nothing mattered more than the schedule awaiting her. The older officer faltered. He glanced down at the card in his hand, piecing together the final part of the puzzle. He understood. And his eyes said what Evelyn hadn't yet been able to, The woman they'd just demanded to verify was the commanding pilot of this very flight. A low ripple of whispers began, quickly smothered by the weight of silence. The man in 1A smirked, not a laugh, but the knowing expression of someone watching the most arrogant person in the room get blindsided by a move they never saw coming. Evelyn wanted to speak, to demand answers, to regain control, but she couldn't. Her throat locked. Because a freezing truth was sinking in the woman she'd humiliated, the one she insisted be removed, was the only person on this aircraft with absolute authority. Aisha took back her documents with a polite nod and walked toward the cockpit, leaving behind a first-class cabin as silent as a chapel. For the other passengers, it was a moment they'd tell for years. For Evelyn, it was the start of a nightmare. Not another word was spoken. Aisha gathered her card and license with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was nothing out of the ordinary. She didn't look for allies, didn't glance at Evelyn. She didn't need to. She walked measured, steady down the narrow aisle toward the open cockpit door. The first officer stepped aside immediately, making way with the clear deference owed to a superior. "We're behind schedule," he murmured. His tone clipped, as if reporting to the only person who mattered. Aisha nodded once, no further words needed. And then, before the stunned eyes of first class, she disappeared behind the heavy cockpit door, the domain of only one kind of person, the one with ultimate authority in the sky. In that moment, the truth sealed and revealed itself all at once. Aisha Munro was the captain of this flight. The cabin fell deathly still. No more whispers, no more sneaky phone recordings. The man in 1A tilted his head, his sharp gaze softening as if confirming a suspicion he'd had all along. A nearby flight attendant exhaled deeply, the tension sliding off her shoulders as she realized the balance of power had shifted. Evelyn sat frozen in 2B, stone still. The shock dragged her out of her fleeting sense of triumph and hurled her into a deep, echoing void. She realized that while she'd been working so hard to push that woman out of her space, she was nothing more than a guest temporary, fragile on ground that belonged to Aisha. First class, which had once felt like Evelyn's stage, was now just a waiting room inside the house that Aisha owned. And Evelyn, the woman who always walked like she owned every room, suddenly felt small, trapped in a leather seat with no escape. But maybe the deepest wound wasn't that Aisha was the captain. It was how she left. No smirk, no parting insult, no triumphant glare to mark victory. She didn't need to. And that quiet dismissal, effortless, unbothered, stripped Evelyn's imaginary crown from her head without a single blow. First class remained silent. But this silence was no longer Evelyn's ally. It was witness. A collective verdict for the woman who had once believed she had the right to judge who belonged. Evelyn stared at the cockpit door that had just closed. And in her head, Aisha's words echoed once more. "They'll be back. For you." For the first time in years, Evelyn Cross wasn't sure she had enough power to stay seated in the chair she'd always thought was hers. The cabin speakers crackled to life, shattering the uneasy silence that had lingered after the unspoken drama. That sound was usually the steady heartbeat of any flight altitude updates, seatbelt reminders, routine schedules, but this time it carried an entirely different weight. "This is your captain speaking." Aisha Munro's voice now filled the first-class cabin, not the voice of a simple woman in 2A who'd just been humiliated minutes earlier, but the voice of a woman holding absolute command over nearly 200 lives on this plane. It was the voice of someone forged by thousands of hours of training and testing, a voice of control. Evelyn Cross shivered. She was still in her seat at 2B, but suddenly, the plush leather felt like a cage. Every word Aisha spoke was a hammer blow to Evelyn's sense of reality. Her life, once an untouchable possession, was now fully in the hands of the very woman she'd dismissed as someone who didn't belong here. "Welcome aboard Flight 8228 with service to London. We'll be departing shortly. Please make yourselves comfortable." Isha's tone was even, low, and steady. No hesitation, no emotion. But that lack of emotion was what unnerved Evelyn most. She couldn't read her, couldn't tell if Aisha remembered every cutting word Evelyn had said, or if she planned to turn that invisible wound into a knife when the moment came. Evelyn tried to soothe herself. This is just business. She'll do her job. But in her mind, that voice wasn't just a pilot giving routine instructions. It was someone calmly declaring, "I'm in control now, and you are not." Several nearby passengers exchanged looks, curiosity mingled with quiet fascination. They weren't whispering about the earlier incident anymore. Now, they were silently registering the moment when power had officially shifted hands. The silver-haired man in 1A tilted his glass slightly, like a quiet toast to the woman who had just stepped into the cockpit. Evelyn closed her eyes, but she couldn't shut out the sound. It echoed inside her skull, every word a reminder of her new place. She'd always believed these flights existed to serve her, but the brutal truth now was this: she was just another passenger. And in this sky, Aisha Monroe was the law. "Thank you for choosing to fly with us," Aisha concluded, her voice dropping, soft yet firm like the click of a lock. "We'll get you to London safely." Safely. The same word Evelyn had used earlier to demand Aisha be removed from first class. Now that very woman was promising Evelyn her safety. The irony wasn't lost on her. It was the most elegant punishment imaginable for the next 7 hours. Evelyn would sit here, utterly dependent on the very woman she'd tried to strip of belonging. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm amber glow. The plane began to taxi. Evelyn opened her eyes, but first class no longer looked the same. She wasn't in her territory anymore. She was in Aisha Monroe's domain. And for the first time, Evelyn Cross felt small, so small she didn't dare breathe too loudly. As the aircraft rolled toward the runway, Evelyn sat frozen, her fingers digging into the armrests as though any movement might shatter what little control she had left. But the world didn't shatter. It burned, she just hadn't noticed yet. In 1A, the silver-haired man set his phone on the table, his fingers typing with the composed efficiency of someone who'd documented many public spectacles before, on social media. His words were sharp, succinct, crafted to spread like wildfire. On a flight from New York to London, a white passenger called airport police on a black woman in first class. But here's what they didn't know: that black woman is the captain of this flight. Attached was a 56-second clip Evelyn calling the flight attendant, her voice loud and commanding. Then the officers arriving, the entire cabin going silent. The clip needed no commentary. It told the story all on its own. Other passengers, once silent spectators, had now become messengers. The young woman in row 3, the one who'd secretly filmed the confrontation, sent the video to her group chat. This is about to blow up. One message became 10, 10 became hundreds. Evelyn had no idea a storm was already forming. But she could feel it in the stolen glances. When the flight attendants walked past, they didn't meet her eyes with deferential smiles anymore. They kept their distance, as if staying clear of an impending explosion. Her phone buzzed once, then again and again. With shaking hands, Evelyn retrieved it. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications messages from colleagues, friends. "Evelyn, what happened?" "Check Twitter, you're trending." She opened Twitter, and the storm hit. Her name, Evelyn Cross, was glowing red-hot on the trending page. The post from 1A had already been shared thousands of times in mere minutes. Hundreds of furious, mocking, and condemning comments cascaded beneath it. Classic white privilege. This is what happens when entitlement meets reality. Remember her face. Evelyn felt the blood surge to her cheeks. She wanted to explain, to scream that it wasn't like that. But how could she? To the world, That clip was the entire story, a perfectly packaged narrative with Evelyn Cross as the villain and the woman she tried to remove as the hero. Social media didn't need trials. Just a clip, a caption, and a name. The verdict had already been rendered. Evelyn set her phone down, her hands trembling. The plush leather seat seemed to close in around her like a box. This was supposed to be a flight to London to close a massive deal. Now, it was a 7-hour ride straight into the center of a public firestorm she didn't know how to survive. She leaned back, closing her eyes halfway, but there was no rest, not in her mind, not in her body. She silenced her phone, but the words, the comments, the invisible stares, they didn't stop. It was an unending trial in her head. She needed something, anything to dull it, a little champagne, a glass of red, something strong enough to blur reality. Evelyn pressed the call button, mustering her old first-class tone. Cabernet, please. A flight attendant appeared, not Chloe, but a middle-aged man with the well-practiced smile of someone who'd worked luxury cabins for years. But this time, his smile was only a mask of professionalism. No warmth. "We serve our guests with mutual respect, ma'am." The words dropped softly, just a reminder. But they hit like a blade, cutting through the last of Evelyn's armor. She froze, taking a beat to register what had just happened. This wasn't small talk. This was an answer, a quiet, deliberate one. And everyone understood it. A murmur rose from the rows behind her. Evelyn didn't have to turn around to know who they were talking about. She grabbed the drink menu but couldn't bring herself to speak again. Even ordering wine now felt like a fight she knew she'd lose. The entire cabin seemed complicit in this silence. No one laughed aloud, but Evelyn could feel the quiet satisfaction in the air, an unspoken consensus. The glances no longer avoided her. They were direct, calm, judging. The same judgment Evelyn had once believed was hers alone to give. She stared toward the cockpit curtain. On the other side, Aisha Monroe, the woman she'd tried to push out of this exclusive space, was flying the plane, carrying Evelyn and nearly 200 others to London with quiet, unshakable authority. Evelyn turned her head away, but the image wouldn't leave her. She realized this wasn't her first-class cabin anymore. It was Aisha's domain. And somehow, without saying a word, Aisha had made Evelyn feel exactly what she'd tried to impose on her, like an intruder. The flight had only just begun. But for Evelyn Cross, the next 7 hours would feel like a sentence. The familiar ding sounded, signaling passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Evelyn Cross pressed the button on her seat and adjusted the recline out of habit. But when the first jolts began, she realized this wasn't the usual light turbulence. The entire plane seemed to shudder violently, a low, resonant hum reverberating through the metal frame as if the giant machine itself was struggling to stay balanced in the pitch-black sky. The cabin lights flickered to a harsh, sterile white. Flight attendants hurriedly checked seatbelts, their steps steady but their eyes stripped of the usual calm. Evelyn gripped her armrests. The irritation that had followed her since takeoff had now transformed into something far more primal: fear. She inhaled, but her lungs betrayed her, refusing to take in enough air. Her heart pounded fast, hard, as if it wanted to burst out of her chest. Evelyn clutched her neck, unsure whether she couldn't breathe or if panic itself was strangling her. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead. Then Aisha's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing turbulence, but there's no cause for alarm. We'll navigate through this shortly." That voice, deep, steady, wasn't what Evelyn wanted to hear. A day ago, it might have reassured her, but now it was a reminder of the unavoidable truth: her life was in the hands of the woman she had publicly humiliated. And here, in this stormy sky, every illusion of control had been ripped away. The tightness in her throat grew worse. Sweat pooled at her temples. Evelyn reached for the call button, but her trembling fingers missed it again and again. She heard the engines fluctuating, the glasses clinking in their holders, and somewhere behind her, a child began to cry. That sound shredded the thin barrier she had built between herself and reality. She wasn't a powerful woman in first class anymore. Up here, she was just flesh and bone trapped in a metal tube hurtling through a storm. Her heart raced so fast her ears began to ring. Evelyn felt herself slipping out of reality. The cabin around her blurred, the lights turning into pulsating halos. For a moment, she felt like she was drowning, reaching blindly for anything that could pull her up. "Help me!" The words escaped her lips as a whisper, meant for no one in particular, but this time, her voice wasn't commanding. It was the frail sound of someone terrified to her core. A navy blue uniform appeared beside her. A warm hand pressed against her shoulder, and a calm, trained voice broke through her spiral. "Ma'am, breathe slowly. We're here with you." For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't care who was watching. She only knew one thing: she needed to survive this. She heard hurried footsteps. The air shifted as someone knelt beside her, blocking the overhead lights. A hand took her wrist, feeling her pulse. Another hand steadied her shoulder, firm and grounding. Rapid pulse. "She's panicking." A woman's voice said, sharp but composed, like someone who had faced crises before. Evelyn turned her head, vision blurred by tears and sweat. In front of her was a woman in simple clothes, but with a presence that felt nothing like an ordinary passenger. Deep, focused eyes reflected the calm of someone who knew how to stay in control when everything else was falling apart. "I'm Dr. Lena Patel." She introduced herself quickly to the attendant beside her. "Bring me the emergency oxygen kit and a pulse oximeter." Lena Patel. Evelyn remembered the name. The Indian woman she had glared at earlier because Lena had cut ahead of her in line while Evelyn was on the phone. Evelyn had written her off as one of those rude types. And now, that same woman was kneeling in front of her, forming a wall between Evelyn and the panic that threatened to swallow her whole. A black flight attendant, petite but quick, appeared behind Lena, carrying a portable oxygen tank. Evelyn recognized her too, the same attendant she had brushed off earlier when boarding. Now the woman was gently placing an oxygen mask over Evelyn's mouth. "Ma'am, breathe in deeply. Slow breaths," the attendant said, her voice soft but firm. There was no room for dignity. Evelyn nodded weakly, her trembling hands holding the mask. Each icy breath through the mask felt like being pulled from underwater. "Please, help me." The words slipped out so small that only the three of them could hear. They weren't the demands of someone used to being served. They were the desperate plea of a frightened child begging to be saved. Lena checked her blood pressure and asked quick questions. "Any heart conditions? Are you on medication?" Evelyn shook her head rapidly, still gasping. "It's just panic," Lena said with certainty, gripping Evelyn's hand to steady her. "You're going to be okay. We're here. You're not alone." And in that moment, Evelyn felt the cruelest irony of all her life was now in the hands of the very people she had looked down on just hours ago. An Indian doctor, a black flight attendant, the very people she'd thought of as less than her. And now they weren't just keeping her comfortable. They were keeping her alive. The oxygen started to work. Evelyn felt her lungs expanding, each breath coming a little deeper, but her heart still pounded, reminding her how close she'd just come to the edge. Cold sweat dampened the back of her neck, tracing an unpleasant chill down her spine. She sank back into her seat, eyes half closed, feeling like her entire body had been wrung out. Beside her, Dr. Lena Patel stayed kneeling, one hand on the oximeter, the other still holding Evelyn's wrist. The black flight attendant stood ready with the medical kit, her watchful eyes scanning Evelyn like a guardian as much as a caregiver. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at them. Two faces she had dismissed earlier as background figures in her carefully constructed world, a doctor of Indian descent, a black flight attendant. People she never thought she'd need. And now, they were the only thing keeping her tethered to life. The humiliation didn't come from the stares of the other passengers. It didn't come from the fact that her name was burning up social media feeds. The real blow came from within the raw, undeniable truth that everything she had clung to power, status, privilege meant absolutely nothing in this moment. She had believed first class was her fortress, a realm where people like Aisha or Lena only existed to serve and obey. But now Evelyn was the one being protected. And the very people she had dismissed. They were the fortress. Evelyn met Lena's gaze and saw no resentment there, no smugness, no judgment, just professionalism, just humanity. And that, somehow, left Evelyn hollow. If they had hated her, she could have convinced herself she still held some power, the kind that makes others resent you. But they didn't need that. They were simply doing their jobs, saving a life. And somewhere behind the cockpit curtain, Aisha Monroe was flying this plane. The woman Evelyn had tried to push out of first class now held the ultimate power, the power to keep everyone safe, including Evelyn. This wasn't just a reversal of roles. It was a collapse. Evelyn closed her eyes not to rest, but to avoid facing herself in the mirror of her own mind. She was no longer the woman who had boarded this plane with a sneer for those she deemed beneath her. Now, she was just a fragile passenger, grateful to be kept alive by the very people she once thought didn't belong. And perhaps for Evelyn Cross, that was the hardest fall of all. When the plane touched down on Heathrow's runway, the smooth landing brought no relief to Evelyn Cross. Around her, passengers exhaled in unison, unbuckling their seatbelts and stretching as though shedding the weight of a long journey. But for Evelyn, the moment those wheels hit the ground only marked the beginning of a nightmare. The familiar announcement chimed, "Welcome to London." Aisha Monroe's voice filled the cabin once again, steady, composed, as if nothing had happened. Evelyn shut her eyes at the sound. There was no sense of victory now, no illusions of control, only the sharp, painful awareness that this woman had spent the entire flight not only holding Evelyn's life in her hands, but also controlling the narrative playing out beyond these walls. Evelyn unlocked her phone the second the signal returned. Within moments, the screen flooded with notifications, messages from colleagues, friends, and dozens of missed calls. Her husband's text appeared at the top. "Evelyn, what's going on? Social media is blowing up with your name." She opened Twitter. Her name was trending worldwide, hashtag Evelyn Cross. The top post was a short clip less than a minute long showing Evelyn calling the flight attendant. Her voice sharp as she demanded that the suspicious woman in seat 2A be checked. The video ended with security officers stepping into the cabin as Aisha calmly stood to follow them. The clip had been shared millions of times, accompanied by a torrent of outrage. White privilege in its rawest form. The moment you publicly humiliate yourself, no one deserves this except those who think skin color is a passport. Below that was an article from a self-described journalist on board. A first-class passenger called security on a black woman for not belonging. That woman turned out to be the captain. Justice unfolded right there in the cabin. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read, her mind suffocated by the roar of thousands of comments. Someone had already found her corporate headshot and plastered it beneath the post. Streams of insults and mockery poured in. This was no longer about an airplane. It had become a public trial, one where Evelyn was branded the face of everything society raged against. She closed Twitter, but the world didn't go away. Her email pinged a message from the company's board of directors, summoning her to an emergency meeting. Evelyn didn't need to open it to know what it meant. The first-class seat that had once symbolized her status now felt like a defendant's chair, one awaiting its verdict. And she knew this time, The verdict would not be hers to control. Her London hotel room felt hollow. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the TV across the room. On screen, Aisha Monroe appeared not the woman Evelyn had humiliated in seat 2A, but a leader, her crisp white pilot's uniform pressed to perfection, her epaulets gleaming with 4 stripes of authority. She sat upright in the interview chair, not folding her arms defensively, not lowering her head for pity. "This isn't just about me," Aisha said, her voice steady and clear, her gaze fixed on the camera as if speaking directly to every viewer. "This is about a system that makes people believe a black woman can't be a captain, that if she's here, she must have cheated her way in, not earned it." Evelyn gripped the edge of the bedsheet. Each word struck her like a stone. She waited for Aisha to say her name, to seize the chance to humiliate her in return, but Aisha didn't. "I'm not angry at the accusations I faced that day," Aisha continued, her hands calmly clasped on her lap, as if she were piloting a jet through turbulence. "I'm angry because this isn't rare. It happens every day to people who aren't lucky enough to have it caught on video, with witnesses or the press to stand up for their truth." The interviewer nodded and asked, "What do you hope the public takes from this?" Aisha didn't hesitate. "I want people to understand that our success doesn't need anyone's validation to be real. I want kids to see me and know the sky doesn't belong to just a select few." No mockery of Evelyn, no revenge. Instead, Aisha had turned the moment Evelyn meant to use to humiliate her into a platform for something larger. It wasn't retribution, it was a lesson. And it made Evelyn feel smaller than any public shaming could. On social media, clips of the interview spread like wildfire. "This isn't just about me. This is about a system," became a rallying cry shared with raised fist emojis and images of open skies. Evelyn stared at the screen. For a moment, she realized she was no longer at the center of this story. Aisha had taken control not to destroy Evelyn, but to rewrite the narrative on her own terms. And that calm, measured grace choosing not to retaliate left Evelyn feeling abandoned in the wreckage of her own failure. The next morning, Evelyn Cross emerged from her hotel room like a shadow. She hadn't slept a minute, just sat on the bed, staring at the phone on the table. It sat silent, but its presence loomed like an unopened verdict. She knew this wasn't the bottom yet. Back at the screen, she opened her email. The first message read simply, "Emergency meeting, mandatory attendance." Sender, chairman of the board. She didn't need to scroll further, but she did. Each word felt like a blade. "Due to the media firestorm surrounding you and its damaging impact on the company's reputation, the board has decided to suspend all of your executive duties, effective immediately. We require your attendance at this emergency meeting to discuss your resignation." Resignation. Evelyn set the phone down, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had always imagined leaving the company on her own terms at a glamorous farewell party, praised as the woman who led them to greatness. Now, she was being shoved out of the very house she had built not as a leader, but as a liability. Social media hadn't gone quiet. Her name still burned at the top of trending lists. The news no longer just recounted the airplane incident, they were digging up every quote, every past remark, piecing together a portrait of her as a symbol of privilege. The media had assembled a courtroom. The public had become the jury. A former colleague texted her, "My advice, disappear for a while. Don't post, don't speak. There's no coming back from this." Evelyn didn't reply. She just sat there, staring at her hands, the same hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that had clinked champagne glasses at power dinners now clenched just to keep them from trembling. The real fall wasn't in the clip or the online firestorm. It was here Evelyn realizing she had lost everything she thought made her who she was. Her job, her reputation, her power, all gone destroyed by a single flight. She had thought she'd merely lost a battle over a seat in first class. But the bitter truth was far worse. Evelyn Cross had lost the entire life she'd spent decades building. She closed her laptop. Outside her window, London buzzed as if nothing had changed. But for Evelyn, the world had become an alien place, one where every foundation of her identity had turned to smoke. A year after that fateful flight, the name Aisha Monroe was no longer tied only to the incident that once shook the internet. It now appeared in aviation magazines, in keynote speeches, and on inspirational posters shared across the world. But Aisha didn't smile because of the fame. Her heart was fixed on something else, something bigger than recognition. Inside a modest auditorium at the National Aviation Academy, Aisha stood on a wooden podium, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, draping her shoulders in gold. Before her sat dozens of young faces, most of them boys and girls from neighborhoods like the one where Aisha grew up, places where the sky was something to look at, not something to reach. They sat upright, eyes lit with awe, as though seeing in her the future they'd never dared to imagine. "Monroe Wings is not just a scholarship," Aisha said, her voice low but resonant, each word as precise as a flight instruction. "It's a promise that the cockpit doors must be open to everyone, regardless of color, gender, or where you began. Monroe Wings." The name of the foundation blazed in bold letters on the banner behind her, alongside a silver pair of wings reaching for the open sky. The settlement money Aisha received from the airline, a sum many saw as the price of a scandal, had been turned into seed money. From that seed grew a training and scholarship program for young people shut out of opportunities simply because they were told they didn't belong here. In the audience, a young woman with neatly tied curly hair scribbled every word. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, a student in Monroe Wings' first class, born in a struggling neighborhood. Maya once thought becoming a pilot was a far-fetched joke. Now, she had logged her first hours in the air, preparing for her certification exam with Aisha herself as her mentor. Aisha glanced at Maya and saw her younger self, a small girl in the back of a classroom, dreaming of a world she wasn't taught to believe was hers. She knew that if someone back then had stood in front of her and said, "You can do this," the sky wouldn't have felt so impossibly far away. After the ceremony, students crowded around Aisha. They asked about skills, about handling the pressure of piloting massive planes, about how to withstand the skeptical stares of others. Aisha answered each question patiently, not in a hurry, with the steady calm of someone who knew she was teaching them not just to fly, but to stand tall in a world that wanted them to bow their heads. Outside, on a small training runway, one of the program's practice planes gleamed under the sun. The words "Monroe Wings" shone brightly on its fuselage, like a promise made tangible. And this time, the sky wasn't just Aisha Monroe's. It belonged to everyone willing to step into it and believe they deserved to be there. In a seaside town in southern England, where narrow alleys led straight to damp sands and the wind carried the thick scent of salt, Evelyn Cross was starting over in a way she'd never imagined. The Seagull's Rest, a cafe where she now worked, was nothing more than a shabby room with a few scarred wooden tables and faded photographs of fishing boats from decades past. Its windows were always fogged with a layer of sea spray, as blurred as Evelyn's life had become. She wore an apron. Her hands, once used to signing contracts, now scrubbed glasses, wiped tables, and wrote down orders with a worn-out ballpoint pen. The work was steady but draining, a monotonous rhythm that felt more like penance than a paycheck. Most customers were fishermen or passing tourists. They called her Eve, never knowing or caring who she used to be. And Evelyn no longer had the strength to explain. Sometimes, she wondered how far she'd fallen. From glamorous conferences with wine and blinding lights to standing behind a battered counter, serving cold tea and fish sandwiches to strangers who would never remember her name. No one here knew about the clip that had destroyed her life, but Evelyn couldn't forget. Sometimes, washing mugs under the tap. She swore she heard the echo of an airplane. PA. "This is your captain speaking," sometimes, when an impatient customer barked at her for slow service. She remembered Aisha's words, spoken so evenly it chilled her. "They'll be back, for you." And she understood now it wasn't anger, it was prophecy. Her savings had been drained by lawsuits and cancelled contracts. The lavish suburban house in London was long sold to pay debts and settlements. She rented a small room above the cafe, a low-ceilinged space with a single bed and a window overlooking the grey sea. On her days off, she sat alone on the shore, watching gulls circle the sky, thinking about the power she'd lost and the price of her pride. The worst part wasn't the menial work or the cramped room, the worst part was being forgotten. She used to fear being hated, but she discovered that being forgotten was far worse. No one mentioned Evelyn Cross anymore. To the world, she was just an old scandal, a social media cautionary tale quickly replaced by the next outrage. Each morning, Evelyn brewed coffee, wiped the counters, unlocked the cafe door, and lived as though that fateful flight had never happened. But deep down, she knew she had fallen from the heights of power to the very bottom of existence. And no one was coming to lift her up. One overcast afternoon, with the sea wind howling through the cafe windows and carrying its briny sting, Evelyn Cross sat behind the counter, her arms aching from a day of scrubbing and serving. The place was nearly empty, save for the faint clink of spoons and cups and the hum of a wall-mounted TV tuned to the local news. Evelyn never really listened. It was just background noise to fill the silence of long, empty hours. But this time, a name made her look up. Captain Aisha Munro launches expanded Munro Wings program. On screen. Aisha stood on a sunlit runway in her pilot's uniform, smiling brightly against a backdrop of blue sky. Around her were young men and women in training uniforms, waving and grinning like they'd stepped into their dreams. The report announced the expansion of Munro Wings, now officially sponsored by the country's largest airline and several private donors. Evelyn froze. The anchor continued, notably. The program's initial funding came from a settlement related to an incident 1 year ago, turning a painful event into an opportunity for lasting change. The words cut deep settlement. Evelyn knew immediately. It was the very money her company had paid to resolve the case, a sum she'd once resented as a humiliating concession. And now, it wasn't just numbers on a check, it had become wings. On screen, Aisha handed a scholarship certificate to a young woman with high-tied curly hair, Maya Rodriguez, the anchor said, one of Munro Wings' top trainees, now on track to earn her commercial pilot license. The girl hugged Aisha, her face glowing as if she were holding her entire future in her arms. Evelyn's chest tightened, not from ordinary jealousy, but from a crushing realization she had paid for Aisha Munro to fly higher than ever. The settlement she had once viewed as a punishment. Aisha had transformed into a lifeline for a new generation young people who would never again hear that they didn't belong here. Evelyn switched off the TV, but the images of Aisha and her students burned in her mind. The little cafe felt suffocating, like a box closing in around her. She knew she would never step foot in that world, the world Aisha had built. And for the first time, Evelyn fully understood the words Aisha had left her with that day on the plane. "They'll be back, for you." Not a threat. A prophecy. And it had come true. Evelyn sat still, her hands resting on the counter, eyes fixed on the fogged-up window. The gray sky outside offered no comfort, but somewhere, on some sunlit runway, Aisha Munro and the wings she'd built were cutting through the clouds toward a horizon farther than Evelyn Cross could ever reach. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.